Namaste and good evening. We are here with Sri Ranjit Hoskote ji and Dr. K. Srinivas Rao ji, Secretary Sahitya Akademi, at Sahitya Akademi's Webline Literature Series. Under this series, today, this evening, we will have a Through My Window program in memory of our distinguished Hindi poet, writer, Padma Bhushan, Jnanapeeth awardee, Kumar Narayan, whom unfortunately we lost in 2017. In the Through My Window series of programs, a distinguished writer speaks of the life and works of another distinguished contemporary writer. Here, Sri Ranjit Hoskote ji will speak of the life and works of Kumar Narayan ji. At the outset, I request Dr. K. Srinivas Rao ji to deliver a welcome address formally. Dr. K. Srinivas Rao ji.
Yeah, thank you, Krishna. Namaskar. Dear Ranjit Hoskote ji, distinguished poet, art critic, thinker, scholar, cultural theorist, translator, and independent curator. Also, I hope this Apurva Narayan, eminent scholar, writer, and translator, and the son of Sri Kumar Narayan ji. All the friends who are catching this event live in YouTube and Facebook channels. I'm glad to welcome all of you for this edition of Through My Window. As my colleague has mentioned, for those of you who are watching this event for the first time, I would like to inform that Through My Window is the platform where a distinguished scholar or a writer talks about another scholar or writer and on that scholar's works, and if required, also on the scholar's life. Normally, the scholar or writer about whom the lecture is being delivered is a person who is no longer with us, but on a very few and rare occasions, exceptions to this rule have been made. And today, Sri Ranjit Hoskote ji will speak on Against the Deluge of Darkness, Reflections on Kumar Narayan's Poetry. Before I formally introduce Sri Ranjit Hoskote ji, actually he doesn't need any introduction, but it is my duty to introduce him. I thank Apurva Narayan from the bottom of my heart for organizing this 3-day program to remember and pay homage to one of the greatest poets and thinkers of modern India, Sri Kumar Narayan ji, who is also a fellow of Sahitya Akademi. And also thanks Apurva ji for inviting Sahitya Akademi to collaborate with you for this program. Friends, as we all know, Sri Ranjit Hoskote ji is a very well-known English poet, art critic, thinker, cultural theorist, and curator. And he has 7 collections of poetry and an English translation of the celebrated 14th century Kashmiri woman saint poet. And he curated India's first ever national pavilion at the Venice Biennale under the title Everyone Agrees It's About to Explode, and curated the 7th Gunju Biennale with Okyu, Envezer, and Huijin Kim, that is in 2008. And he has curated retrospectives of several major Indian artists, including Jahangir Sabawala, Shakti Burman, Atul Dodia, as well as M.F. Hussain and Jogan Chaudhary. And he has been visiting fellow at the International Writing Program, University of Iowa, and a writer in residency at Villa Waldbeta, Munich, Theater der Welt at Essen Mulheim, and the Polish Institute, Berlin. And he has also been researcher in residence at BAK, that is Basis für Akute Kunst Utrecht. He has been received the Sahitya Akademi Translation Prize, and Sahitya Akademi Golden Jubilee Award, and the S.H. Raja Literature Award, and the Sanskriti Award for Literature. Without taking up much of your time, now I request Sri Ranjit Hoskote ji to commence his talk on Sri Kumar Narayan ji. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Dr. Srinivas Rao, Dr. Krishna Kimbahone, for your wonderful words of welcome. It's a matter of great honor for me to be speaking here on Kumar Narayanji's work on this very special day, which is his 94th birth anniversary. मैं शुक्रगुजार हूँ साहित्य अकादमी का, खास करके आपका श्रीनिवास राव जी और श्री अपूर्व नारायण जी का, कि आप दोनों ने मुझे इस काबिल समझा कि मैं आज मेरे कुछ विचार कुंवर नारायण जी के काव्य के बारे में यहाँ प्रस्तुत करूँ। और मैं ये भी जानता हूँ कि आज श्रोतृगण में कई ऐसे आदरणीय महारथी हैं जिनका मुझसे कई ज्यादा अधिकार है इस संदर्भ में बात करने का। लेकिन I would like to assure all of you that मैं हिंदी साहित्य के संदर्भ में आज कोई टिक्का टिप्पणी करने का साहस या दुस्साहस तो मैं करूँगा नहीं। मैं केवल एक वाचक और एक कवि के स्वरूप में आज आपके सामने ही कुछ विचार प्रस्तुत करने जा रहा हूँ। What I would like to do today is really to speak as a poet, a reader, an artisan, a pilgrim. And many of you would indeed have had this question in mind, so I'll deal with it right away. Why should an Anglophone poet of a younger generation speak on a Hindi poet of an older generation? Kumar Narayanji was born in 1927. He was just a year younger than my own father, who was born in 1926. And I was born in 1969. There is indeed a greater gap in age. We do not write in the same language. But both the Sahitya Akademi and Apurva have taken a great risk here. I'm deeply aware of this. I feel it is tragic that in a robustly multilingual country like ours, we tend to live and work and write in linguistic silos. This is a condition of modernity. It is not a condition of our tradition. In our tradition, we always celebrated polyglossia. People worked in multiple languages. They articulated themselves in multiple literary universes. I see no reason why this cannot be the case today. So it is in that spirit that I offer these few tentative provisional thoughts on Kumar Narayanji. Why does any poet think about the work of any other poet, especially as magisterial and distinguished a poet as Kumarji from a previous generation? I came to Kumar Narayanji's poetry as a poet who writes in one language, but is nourished by multiple languages and literatures. I might well write in English, but I read across a variety of other languages. I came to his work as a poet who engages with his own time, but is also preoccupied with deep historical time and its transcultural entanglements. I came to his work as a poet who is also a translator. I came to his work as a poet who is also engaged with the other arts, and as a poet in whose work research plays a key role. For all these reasons, I have found Kumar Narayan a compelling figure, a cultural practitioner, and exemplar of practice. As we all know, he was a polymath. His work straddled poetry, fiction, literary criticism, cultural commentary. He was a translator from multiple languages, and his work itself was distinguished by formal experiment. He revisited the epic form by way of the Upanishad, the Kathopanishad, twice over. He visited the form of the verse biography and animated it with fresh life through the book Kumar Jiva, which is going to be at the center of my reflections today. I'm aware that many of you are perfectly familiar with Kumarji's life, but I'm going to frame a very, very brief biographical portrait so that those of us who've joined who might not be familiar with this are on the same page. He was born in 1927, which means that he came of age in the very first year of independence in 1948. At the age of 28 in 1955, he set out on a voyage which took him to Europe, to various parts of Europe, indeed also to the Soviet Union. And it is in the work of that young man that we see someone who was actively engaged with the work of his contemporaries elsewhere, some somewhat older, others of his same generation. And these were interests that were to accompany him through his life. From his own generation, the Polish poet Zbigniew Herbert, for a certain slightly older generation, Czesław Miłosz, the Greek poets Yanis Ritsos and Georgos Eferis. In the Anglophone world, of course, Eliot, Wallace Stevens. In the French world, Paul Valéry, Louis Aragon. And in the world of Latin American poetry, Pablo Neruda and Octavio Paz. And of course, preeminently in the German-speaking world, it was Bertolt Brecht. So I'm putting all these names out not to create a kind of a roll call or roster of honor, but just to demonstrate what was the rich and diverse literary universe of which in his late 20s and early 30s, Kumar Narayan was already a part. We tend, for reasons that might well be unavoidable, to, as I said earlier, fit our writers into silos. So we tend to think of Hindi writers or Marathi writers or Gujarati writers or Kashmiri writers, forgetting all the while that you are defined not only by the language in which you write, but to the universe of literatures that you respond to. And I'll have more to say about this as we go along. So I'm inviting now those who are not already aware of this to consider that this is the stellar kind of figure we are looking at here, a poet who stands with these contemporaries that I just named. And it's in that spirit that we ought to read him and to honor his work and to take it forward through study, through translation. So his civilizational commitments were, I would say, dual. On the one hand, as the citizen of a newly independent post-colonial India, he was strongly committed to this country, its evolving social and cultural questions, its new political experience as a republic. And all this also comes through in his writing. In the larger world, we see that he came of age and did a great deal of his writing in the post-World War II era, in the Cold War. And we see also, not that I'm pegging him too tightly in a political framework, but we see very clearly that as the member of a non-aligned country, as a citizen of a country that was preeminent in the non-aligned movement, he was able to have allegiances on both sides of the Iron Curtain. In Poland, in Hungary, as it might be, also in West Germany, in France, in the UK and the USA, and also in the Soviet Union. So once again, I would like to think about Kumar Narayanji as someone whose work benefited from our place in the non-aligned movement. It's fashionable these days to question and ridicule non-alignment. I would say that non-alignment acted as, in fact, a seminal ground of internationalism for many, many of our writers and poets, fiction writers, and visual artists, and other kinds of cultural practitioners. So this is something I just put in place. It's these, if you will, historical locations that you see active throughout Kumar Narayan's poetry. The key question often is, how does one parse history? Is it legacy? Is it trauma? Is it part of the current of life? And it is these questions that I want to open out today, and to think through with you these questions of how there were particular meditations on temporality that characterize his work. But before I do that, I would like to also come to a key question. We use this word modernism relatively loosely. There is that school of thought which seems to think that modernism is some kind of universally executable program, one associated with the trope of rupture with everything that came before. And in a Euro-American context, this might well be true. Modernism arrived as a rupture with foregoing bourgeois taste and certain sensibilities that had been sedimented in a late romantic moment. And modernism, in Ezra Pound's phrase, consisted in making it new. Now, the reality, even in the Euro-American context, was much more complex, as we all know. And while modernism did indeed break with bourgeois taste and a late romantic 19th century sensibility, it also looked elsewhere. A key move in many initiatives within the modernist umbrella was the primitivist turn, or the exoticist mode. A sculptor like Epstein, for instance, through his dialogues with Ananda Kumaraswamy, was inspired by Gupta sculpture. Picasso, as we know, turned to the legacies of Western Africa, often expropriated from their native home and brought to the West European Museum. But he was inspired by West African mask traditions, for instance. Pound himself owed a great deal to Tang poetry, which nourished imagism. So it was the tradition of the Chinese literati to which he turned to produce a new kind of literary form within English and within Western literature, if you will. In India, I would suggest, and we all know, writers of Kumar Narayan's generation approached the question of modernism in somewhat different tenor for several reasons, and naturally I simplify here. For one, poets and fiction writers and theater makers of Kumar Narayan's generation addressed a modernism that was already entangled with a slightly different question of modernity. So the aesthetic project of cultural rupture was entangled with a political program of reform or of nationalist change, or in some cases of a sort of ethno-nationalist upsurge. So this was a far more complex scenario than the one faced by some of the European and American poets that I just mentioned. Within the Hindi world itself, Kumar Narayan arrived on the stage at a point when there had already been at least 4 great turns towards the modern. And I'll very, very briskly summarize them. Many of you are already intimately familiar with these things, but I need to put them on the page so I can build on them as I go along. Already in the aftermath of the Great Uprising of 1857 through the late 19th and early 20th centuries, there had been a turning away from the legacy in Hindi of the Riti Kal period, which was essentially a rich and sumptuous poetry in Braj Bhasha. Over and against Braj Bhasha and the other languages within the Hindavi spectrum, there emerged by the end of the late 19th century in the thinking of its founders, a new and robust and muscular Hindi. In the work of pioneers like Mahavir Prasad Dwivedi and Ramchandra Shukla, we see the emergence of a new Hindi, which becomes the basis of our official Hindi, which relies really on a basis in Khadi Boli and in Sanskrit. This was already a huge turning away from linguistic and literary practices, a turning away from Braj, a turning away from Urdu, which, as we know, also was to take on ultra-nationalist coloring in the work, for instance, of Bhartendu Harishchandra or Pratap Narayan Mishra. So that's one horizon that I would ask you to keep in mind as we think of Kumar Narayan's poetry. Another turn in the 1920s and 30s, as you know, was embodied by the Chayavad poets, in whose work you see a certain emergence of a late romantic abutting on a more humane, human-centered poetry, a way of thinking through human experience as it's found particularly in the work of Nirala and of Mahadevi Varma, among other major poets. Yet another turn in the 1930s from a left-wing tendency is the work of the progressive writers. To them, poetry was to be the vehicle of the revolution, and it was premised on the idea of a new human being to emerge through political revolution as well as aesthetic change. And then, of course, the movement with which in his early years, Kumar Narayan was closely associated, one pioneered by Agyeji in the 1940s, the so-called Nai Kavita. And it was in the third of Agyeji's anthologies, the Tisra Saptak, that some of Kumar Narayan's poetry was introduced to his readers on a larger scale. I put all this in place only so that we have a more complex notion of what modernism in an Indian context can mean. Not only something that arrives from outside, but something that is intimately connected to turbulences, crises, civilizational questions within. And it is to that extent an indigenously achieved modernism. Vitally, the alternative civilizational sources to which Euro-American modernists turned for replenishment as aesthetic impulses were organically present to post-colonial modernists like Kumar Narayan as cultural propositions. It was one thing for an Ezra Pound to think about the Tang poets of far away and long ago. It was another thing for Kumar Narayan to be in Lucknow, in Delhi, in northern India, and to have at hand the Upanishads, the Mahakavyas, the work of Urdu poets like Ghalib and Mir. These were, as I have said here, organically present as cultural propositions, not just as objects or images, but as cultural propositions fully accoutered in their political and philosophical contexts, living traditions, not elements of a museum of forms. This, in my mind, is the difference that imparts to Kumar Narayan's poetry a vibrant urgency and a wholly different relationship to the past than one might find in a number of his Euro-American contemporaries. Because he was not looking at the past as a museum of artifacts and fossils to be reanimated on the other side of a rupture. Rather, the past was a continuity to be engaged with, to be re-experienced, to be calibrated, to be renewed. Thus, in my view, modernism for Kumar Narayan was not premised on the trope of rupture, but on the trope of a renewal of encounters, dialogues, journeys already set in motion and sometimes thwarted by modernity, with its apparatus of doctrinaire nationalism, industrialization, and individualism. In profound ways, I think Kumar Narayan's vision was a Tagorean vision. And I think this when, for instance, Apurva has beautifully written of how at the center of his father's work is the idea of jijivisha, the will to live, the will to articulate one's concerns and contents across time. And I would relate this Kumar Narayan-esque, I would say, jijivisha with Tagore's idea of a Jibon Devata, a life force conceived of as a divinity. And it's in this context that you see this coming again and again to the fore in Atmajayi and in Vajashrava Ke Bahane, both long works premised on the Upanishads, and in Kumar Jiva. And I'm going to read now a poem called Ojas, where this tremendous will to live across time, transhistorically, comes very much to the fore. And if you'll indulge me, I'm going to read Ojas, and it goes like this. तब तक इजिप्ट के पिरामिड नहीं बने थे जब दुनिया में पहले प्यार का जन्म हुआ, तब तक आत्मा की खोज भी नहीं हुई थी, शरीर ही सब कुछ था। काफी बाद विचारों का जन्म हुआ, मनुष्य के मस्तिष्क से अनुभवों से उत्पन्न हुई स्मृतियां और जन्म जन्मांतर तक खींचती चली गई। माना गया कि आत्मा का वैभव वो जीवन है जो कभी नहीं मरता। प्यार ने शरीर में छिपी इसी आत्मा के उजास को जीना चाहा। एक आदिम देह में लौटती रहती है वो अमर इच्छा। रोज अंधेरा होते ही डूब जाती है वो अंधेरे के प्रलय में, और हर सुबह निकलती है एक ताजी वैदिक भोर की तरह, पार करती है सदियों के अंतराल और अपाट दूरियां, अपने उस अर्धांग तक पहुंचने के लिए जिसके बार बार लौटने की कथाएं एक देह से लिपटी हैं। In Apurva's translation, it goes like this. First light. The pyramids of Egypt had not been built when the first love was born in the world. The search for a soul, too, had not begun till then. The body was everything. Thoughts took birth much later from the mind. Memories were born from experience and stretched on for life after life. It came to be believed that the soul's splendor was the life that never dies. Love wished to live the dawn of this undying soul mantled in body and flesh. That wish of eternity keeps returning again and again inside a primeval body. Daily, as dusk descends, it drowns down in a deluge of darkness and rises again each morning like a new Vedic dawn, traverses a hiatus of centuries and fathomless distances to reach its other half, the tales of whose eternal returns stay embraced to a body. You will all have noticed the incredible image from Plato's Symposium, the two halves eternally, one pursuing the other to achieve wholeness, which defines this poem, this notion of an eternal spirit, as well as the claims of the bodied self. Now, this brings me to a key theme in Kumar Narayan's poetry, which is time. Time in the form of multiple and rival temporalities as they course through his oeuvre from the very beginning to the late period. I begin this reflection on the temporalities of Kumar Narayan's poetry with the opening paragraph of his introduction to Kumar Jiva, published in 2015. It is a verse biography of the great 4th century AD monk, the Buddhist monk and translator Kumar Jiva, born to a Kashmiri father and a mother from Kucha. He was the key figure in the dissemination of Buddhism along the Silk Road and further out to China, Korea, and Japan. He's usually described as the translator of the Vaipulya Sutras, or the Long Sutras in Buddhism. Evidence and close reading suggests that many of these do not pre-exist in the Buddhist canon. I would prefer to see Kumar Jiva as someone who produced these incredibly marvelous and operatic long sutras to suit his Chinese audience who were used to Baroque literary formulations. So Kumar Jiva, which will feature greatly in my talk today, is, I would suggest, also a certain hidden autobiography of Kumar Narayan himself as a poet straddling time and place. And I'm going to read briefly from the introduction, where he says, and this pertains to these reflections on time that I want to set going now, whilst remaining aware of the time at my own disposal. I see it's 5:26. This is how the introduction opens. I quote, एक महापुरुष की जीवनी को आधार बनाकर उसके समय और समाज को ज्यादा जीवंत और घनिष्ठ तरीके से अनुभव किया जा सकता है. And I'm actually reading his biography of Kumar Jiva. I have to go back to the introduction. It goes like this. एक महान जीवन चरित केवल अपने ही समय में नहीं जीता, इस जीने के दौरान अपने विचारों और चर्या से अपना एक प्रति समय या समानांतर समय भी रचता है, जो उसके पश्चात भी चिरकाल तक जीवित रहता है. बुद्ध को जितना उनके युग ने बनाया, उससे कहीं अधिक बुद्ध ने अपने युग को बनाया. ये समानांतर समय इतना दृढ़ और विशाल हो सकता है कि उसकी अपेक्षा प्रतिक्षण बीतता भौतिक समय अयथार्थ है लगे. बुद्ध के विचारों का समय स्थायी है. कुछ इसी तरह संसार के महान साहित्यों, कलाओं और विचारों के समयों को भी सोचा जा सकता है. End of quote. I have been deeply attracted to this concept that Kumar Narayan ji floats here of a prati samay, and I'm tempted to gloss it as a counter time. What is being suggested here is that over again against the ephemeral, ongoing, daily, worldly time of events is a counter time, a time within the work, a time within literature, a time within the artwork, a time that is not subject to external events and which is present within the work, can be released upon aesthetic encounter. I'm tempted to gloss it also by comparison with Walter Benjamin's notion of the Jetztzeit, the now time, which explodes from within an aesthetic encounter with a work at times of historical danger. It's a parallel time, an inner transhistorical time that unfolds in the consciousness and indeed is a key mode of the expansion of consciousness. I would like to build on this a little. I turn now to a journal entry of 26th February 2003 that Kumar Narayan ji makes. It is, you will find it in Dishaon Ka Khula Akash, beautifully edited by Yatindra Mishra. It's on page 80 if anybody has the book at hand. I do actually believe in close reading because whether it's Kumar Narayan ji or many other figures, I find that people arrive at worthy and absolutely relevant conclusions. But as readers, as listeners, we tend to scramble after the conclusions to hear the texture of where in the poetry, where in the prose did this poet work towards these conclusions. So if please do indulge and forgive me for reading from the originals, but I think we have a better bridge between us as speaker and audience when we're literally on the same page. This is a diary entry from 26th February 2003. It opens with one single marvelous word, Kal Vibhajan, periodization, the division of time into phases, periods, dynastic styles. Kal Vibhajan. इस तरह नहीं करें कि एक राजा मरा तो दूसरा गद्दी पर आया, यानी एक शासन काल समाप्त हुआ, दूसरे का शुरू हुआ. साहित्य और कलाओं में ऐसा नहीं होता. It's not this way with literature and the arts. बड़ी कला, बड़ी साहित्य कभी नहीं मरते. वे विस्तृत होते हैं. They do not die, they expand themselves. उनके प्रभाव घटते बढ़ते रहते हैं और वे आसानी से एक काल से दूसरे में, एक देश से दूसरे में, एक भाषा से दूसरी में आ जा सकने में सक्षम होते हैं. I take this diary entry to be a manifesto. As you can all see, he speaks here of how the time that is within this prati samay, within the life of great art, of great literature, does not die. It waxes and wanes. He characterizes it as an intensity. And not only does it wax and wane in intensity within a language or a time or a space, but it transits among them. It can move from one time to another, from one country to another, from one language to another. And this to me is an extraordinary manifesto of the transcultural. It's a superb account of the inner time of the arts that transcends these boundaries of desh, kal, patra, bhasha that we are tempted to impose on literature and the arts. It is in fact a transcultural inner biography of the arts. So in the work of Kumar Narayan's richly historical imagination, I am reminded of Hans-Georg Gadamer's model of the fusion of horizons. Many of you, again, will be familiar with this. Gadamer's actual problem is that of the classicist. He asks how, as a subject within the contemporary, how can he reach across to times, places, and cultures long dead, classical cultures, for instance, as it might be Rome or Greece. And it is through a releasement of the self towards the axioms and the customs and the parameters of that time. And how do we make that intermediate ground between our time and times past, our language and languages other than ours? So I would like to think of how this fusion of horizons is a key feature of the poetry of Kumar Narayan, indeed also of his fiction, wonderfully translated by Apurva Narayan and John Fetter elsewhere. And I would also like to think of how this fusion of horizons feeds into and nourishes the expansion of the consciousness, the Cheto Vistar, into which we are invited by Kumar Narayan's poetry. And I would like now to come to a final set of reflections where I'll think about the precise outcomes for Kumar Narayan's poetics of these questions. There are about 4 points that I wish to flag. The first of these is Kumar Narayan's commitment to not forgetting, to anamnesia, as I have characterized it in other contexts, to fight all that imposes forgetfulness upon us, and to bear in mind, to cherish, and to grapple with not just the past, but our plural pasts in all their intricacy, with all their problems. And this ability to live in a deep civilizational time is what provides the poet with so many sources of renewal. It speaks of an imagination that is constantly in dialogue with its predecessors. And one of its key modes is research. You will find it in a number of the poems collected into his collections. You will find it definitely in Kumar Jiva. Research and travel were key modes for this poet. The bibliography of Kumar Jiva, for instance, we find his immense and erudite reading of art history, of anthropology, of philosophy, of history, all of it nourishing this work. And I'm reminded of a joke I often tell. A dear friend of mine, a novelist, Ilya Troyanov, once fell off his chair laughing when I said I was working on a poem on Ghalib and researching for it. And he said, "Why do you poets need to do research? That's our thing, you know, novelists and fiction writers." So a poet like me in this generation is greatly reassured by such a magisterial example as Kumar Narayanji's, when you see the depth of the research that sustained his work as a poet. And that researching self, that self in search of deep civilizational time, is also a nomadic self, a migrant self. The way in which the Silk Route its transcontinental reach of the Silk Route is invoked in Kumar Jiva, it really sets us thinking about how important the notion of migration was to Kumar Narayan. And in fact, he flags it in his introduction. स्थान परिवर्तन की मनुष्य जाति के सांस्कृतिक जीवन में ऐतिहासिक भूमिका रही है. Migration has played a historic role in the cultural life of humankind. Once again, this is an argument against borders, against distances. And in fact, the volume of translations that he produced is called exactly that, Nasimain Aduriya, And I'll come to that in a moment. I also want, having spoken of this deep civilizational time that is a key feature of Kumar Narayan's poetry, I want to think also about his anchored cosmopolitanism, which Harish Trivedi has marvelously spoken of as an embedded cosmopolitanism. Someone working in his own language that he chose, when he indeed could have chosen others, in his own place, was yet wonderfully open to a cosmopolitan sensibility. He was in encounter with fellow practitioners across time and across space. And if you look at Nasimai and Naduriya, it is incredible that the translations begin with Homer and Sappho from the Greek world, going on to Dante, Shakespeare, onward to Strindberg and Whitman, Cavafy, Rainer Maria Rilke, T.E. Hume, Pound, Lawrence, Louis Aragon, Bertolt Brecht, Borges, Neruda, Attila Yosef, Günther Eich, Yanis Ritsos, my linguistic abilities fail in the face of Polish, Anna Swierczynska, Vasco Popper, Zbigniew Herbert, Günter Grass, Derek Walcott, Ted Hughes, and a number of other poets. So we see here this incredible range of reference points, inspirations, fellow spirits that are brought into the world of a Hindi poet, such that the very notion of that language gets expanded. And we all, any poet who has worked in translation knows that you're not simply taking something from a so-called source language and putting it mechanically in some target language. This very terminology is greatly mistaken with its militaristic overtones. What typically happens is that you open yourself up to a certain osmosis. You bring something over and your own language, your own sensibility is inevitably transformed, transmuted, it's certainly affected for the good. And we see this in action. So I would also like to flag the possibility that, in fact, the certainty that translation was not an optional extra for Kumar Narayan. It was central to his practice. It certainly played a key role in the way he thought about poetry and poetics, the way he practiced them. And I would think that by this act, he was not simply a cosmopolitan, that is someone who is happy with and consoled by the privileges of being in many places and times. I think his was an active cosmopolitics. This is a slightly different thing. It is when you take your wager on diversity and on multiplicity, you take it ahead and you make that a political commitment to be available in multiple literary universes, to work across languages, to knock down borders, to defy borders. That is a political commitment. So I would also describe the work of Kumar Narayan not only under the sign of an embedded cosmopolitanism, which is undoubtedly true, but I would also think about it as an embodiment of cosmopolitics. I'd also like to dwell briefly, and many friends and colleagues did this yesterday. I would like to think of how he embraced the other arts, how he was transdisciplinary. There's also a wonderful lecture that he gave on the subject of the transdisciplinarity of the literary arts. And I think here about his work on cinema, the Lekhak cinema, where he dwells on all the key upsurges in cinema of the 70s and 80s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, the French New Wave, the New German cinema, our own parallel cinema. And again, of the essays here, which I've been reading, I was very struck by one where he dwells on Volker Schlondorff's film based on Proust's work, Swan in Love, and the film Utsav from 1984, which of course is a cinematic account of Mritya-Kritikam. And there again, you find how he dwells very strongly on the notion of time. And I'll quote here, इस संबंध में कथा साहित्य यानी शाब्दिक कलाओं, the arts of the word, और फिल्म कला के बीच एक दिलचस्प सवाल की ओर भी ध्यान जाता है. Our attention goes to quite an interesting difference between the arts of the word and the arts of film. एक प्रूस्ट या जॉयस जिस अंतर्द्वंद और लंबे यथार्थ काल को अपने उपन्यासों में शब्दों द्वारा कुछ 100 पृष्ठों में घनीभूत करते हैं, फिल्म कला उसे 2-3 घंटों में बिंबों, शब्दों और ध्वनियों के संयोजन द्वारा जब प्रस्तुत करती है, तो वह दरअसल उपन्यास की सीमा को किन मानों में विस्तृत और किन मानों में सीमित कर रही होती है. It's an interesting line of inquiry. When you translate the arts of the word, what gets done across the duration of a novel in 100 pages, how within 2 or 3 hours does a filmmaker translate that? Once again, you see that even across the arts, the key trope for Kumar Narayan was that of translation. The translation of duration, the translation of experience, the translation of the inner time of one art into the inner time of another, and what are the gains and the losses, the expansions and the limitations of that. So you see once again this constant thinking about duration, not only as a condition, but as a constitutive feature. And I'll close with by flagging this idea of how his work really provides us with a toolkit, if you will, for I'm quite aware of the rather amusing use to which that term toolkit has been put in recent times in our public life, but I insist on using it. A toolkit for a humanist resistance to tyranny. Purushottam Agarwal, in his beautiful preface to the selected poems, the Pratinidhi Kavitaएं of Kumar Narayan, published by Rajkamal, speaks of how in his work there is a constant counterpoint between the ethical and the political, Naitik or Rajnaitik, and how it's not one against the other, but the interpenetration, the counterpoint between the two. And as I read through Kumar Narayan's poetry, I keep thinking to myself, he conceives of history not just as memories and objects, not just as documents and documents and monuments, not just in museums and archaeological sites, but the key question is, to what end are indeed we recalling history in the work we do through poetry? What kind of individual subjectivity are these works relevant to? And the title of one of his works, I think, offers us a crucial clue, Hashiye Ka Gawah, the witness in the margins, the witness from the margins. The word Hashya also reminds me, as someone partly connected also, another part of my life is devoted to the visual arts. I think of the incredibly elaborate margins of Mughal paintings, which are not mere decoration, but they often have a detail, they have certain inscriptions which are germane and integral to the work. They are not secondary to the work. So from that point of view, the Hashya is not the periphery. It's also a place of enablement and empowerment from which, indeed, to bear testimony. The authority of the poet who bears witness from the margins is a considerable authority because it's an authority that renounces power. It renounces the privileges and the opportunities of power. And we all know how, through his life, Kumar Narayan stayed aloof of the, if you will, the marketplace of the arts. He preferred to remain at a certain remove and from there to offer this testimony. So it's for these reasons that I took the title from this poem, Ojas, for my talk today. And his poetry was really an argument against the deluge of darkness. So I'll leave you with these thoughts of how his poetry pivoted, at least in my particular and provisional reading of it, around the experience of recovering a deep civilizational time, a commitment to anamnesia, and anchored or embedded cosmopolitanism or a cosmopolitics expressed actively through acts of translation, a continuous practice of translation. A transdisciplinarity in which once again the other arts were embraced both for themselves, but also for the conclusions to which they could lead the poet in terms of framing his poetics. And finally, how the poetry in its entirety offered us the wherewithal to mount a humanist resistance to tyranny, to master discourses, to narratives that tend to overwhelm the freedom of and agency of the individual self. So I'm going to conclude once again with a poem that was also a manifesto, I think, for Kumar Narayan. It's a poem that's simply called poetry. It's called Kavita. It goes like this. Kavita वक्तव्य नहीं गवाह है, कभी हमारे सामने, कभी हमारे पहले, कभी हमारे बाद. कोई चाहे भी तो रोक नहीं सकता भाषा में उसका बयां, जिसका पूरा मतलब है सच्चाई, जिसकी पूरी कोशिश है बेहतर इंसान। उसे कोई हड़बड़ी नहीं कि वो इश्तहारों की तरह चिपके, जुलूसों की तरह निकले, नारों की तरह लगे और चुनावों की तरह जीते। वो आदमी की भाषा में कहीं किसी तरह जिंदा रहे, बस। In Apurva's translation, poetry, it is not a declaration, but a witness, sometimes before us, sometimes after us, sometimes ahead of us. Even if one wants, one cannot stop its testimony in language, which only means truth, only seeks a gentler being. It is in no scramble to be pasted up like ads, marched out like parades, chanted like slogans, or won like elections. In the language of people, it be alive somewhere, somehow, that's all. And it's with that thought that I will conclude what I have to say today. I thank you all for your attention, and I thank again the Sahitya Akademi and Srinivas Raoji, Krishna, and indeed at the center of this festivity, Apurva Narayan, for having given me this opportunity to share my views and thoughts. Thank you very much indeed.
Hearty thanks, Ranjit ji, for your warm and mesmerizing talk. You have brilliantly elaborated upon the cultural significance of the bard's immense contribution to literature. In the form of his literary works of art, Kumar Narayanji will be with us forever. Thanks again. Thanks to Dr. K. Srinivas Rao ji, and hearty thanks yet again to Sri Apurva Narayanji, because of whom this was happened, this program. We could invite you, and I could keep in touch with Apurva ji as well. So thanks to all of you again.
Thank you so much.
This program ends here. I thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you.